and welcome back to my channel, where I'm going to cover the Ranger's Drakewarden class specialization from the Fizban's Treasury of Dragons supplement, providing a brief description of the subclass, as well as explain and set up the various features gained. A Drakewarden is a special class of Ranger archetype that gains a better understanding of how nature works, so much so that they are able to use that understanding to create a link and gain access to a Draconic spirit. Using that link, a Drakewarden can bring forth a Drake companion, which will learn and grow in step with the Drakewarden, becoming more powerful as the Ranger gains more experience over time. The Ranger, over the course of the first few levels, develops that bond and understanding with nature, which is what allows the Draconic spirit to make itself known to the Ranger at the time that they choose their archetype. Though in this case it could be said that becoming a Drakewarden was ordained in some way, shape, or form. Rangers will select their archetype at level 3, thus explaining how your character will create that tight natural bond with nature, so that by the time your character can choose their class specialization, the spirit of the Drake is simply waiting for that final piece of the link to fall into place. This means you as a player will be able to learn the concepts of how a Ranger works before you need to try to figure out how to incorporate the concepts of how to manipulate a Drake companion during your encounters. To help us out, I've already created a level 2 Ranger, and all I have to do is drop this into place in order to be able to level our Ranger up. Now, because I only have Fizban's module loaded, it automatically applied the Drakewarden's class specialization. Normally, there would be a selection screen that pops up, and then you would choose your specialization from that. Now, the first feature that your character is going to gain is called Draconic Gift, which grants your character a new cantrip as well as the means to fully understand the Draconic language, or another language of your choice if you happen to already have the Draconic language understood. The cantrip is called Thaumaturgy and can be simply added to your character sheet, as it is designed to complement any spells your character has already gained at level 2. So let's go ahead and add the cantrip to our character sheet first. You'll want to click on Spells, and then when you do that, you'll have this search box here. All you have to do is type in Thaum, and you'll be able to see Thaumaturgy right there. Now, it comes from the player's handbook. So if you don't have any other modules loaded, which I had to load this in order to get at it, you'll need to make sure that that's loaded through the module section. I'm just going to drag and drop this into place, and we should now see that we have a cantrip here. As for the languages, it would only make sense to take another language if your character already understood the Draconic language. However, I suppose it could be viewed that if you're trying to go through the process of creating a role-playing situation where your character doesn't initially understand the Draconic language while you are trying to interface with your Drake companion, I suppose that could be delayed a little bit in order to be able to learn that. However, that's entirely up to you and the DM as to how you want to work that. Generally, though, you get this language capability right at the start. Now, even though you have gained the ability to summon a Drake, your character still has to be able to communicate with them. And to be able to really communicate with them, you need to understand the Draconic language. But it is fully your choice. So I'm actually going to go ahead and show you how this would work if you were to add the Draconic language to your character sheet. All you have to do is go to the Abilities tab, hit Enter in the Languages section to get a blank line, and then just type in Draconic. And I can prove that because I've already got the Dungeon Master set up to actually allow me to type in a test string in the Draconic language. And as you can see here, anyone who doesn't understand the Draconic language is going to see those glyphs, if you will. Whereas this particular character, because they understand the Draconic language, will actually see what it translates to, which is right here. Also at Ranger level 3, your character is going to gain the Drake Companion feature, and it is this feature that allows your character to summon a physical manifestation of the Draconic spirit. Once your character summons the Drake, it will respond to all of their commands and will remain friendly to all of your character's allies, as well as your character themselves. However, while the feature information panel goes through the process of explaining how to set up your companion in relation to pen and paper, it doesn't cover how Fantasy Grounds has to deal with this. As such, we're going to have to make some minor adjustments in order for you, the player, to be able to use your Drake companion, and unfortunately it's the Dungeon Master that has to be the one that makes all of these adjustments. And we'll get to the process of showing you how that's going to work here in a moment. First, I want to finish the explanation of this particular feature. There are a number of adjustments that have to be made each time you actually go through the process of summoning your Drake. And the first is the damage type the Drake will do. This is done via the Draconic Essence trait that can be found on the Drake Companion's template, again, which I'll get to in a bit, or on the Summoned Drake's information sheet once it's shared. The damage type can be changed each time you summon your Drake, so that if you initially summoned the Drake that would do fire damage, at a later point in time when you summon the Drake again, you could change that to cold damage. You can also adjust its appearance each time you summon the Drake, but this is not really going to have any effect on what the Drake actually does, just simply how it looks. But it's a great way to set up distinct appearances for each type of damage that you could go through and do. And as there are 5 types of damage that you can choose from, you might want to come up with 5 separate appearances. During combat, the Drake is going to share your initiative roll, and it will go immediately after your own character takes their turn. And this is because it will require you to declare an action as a bonus action on your turn in order for the Drake to actually do anything. For example, on your turn, you could declare that a Drake will attack a given creature. And you do that as a bonus action. And when the Drake takes their turn, that's exactly what will happen. But if you do not declare an action for the Drake, it will only execute a dodge action. And yes, this does mean your character is going to have to use a bonus turn every single turn to give that Drake an action. However, there will be some DMs that are a lot more lenient in relation to that. For example, if you were to declare that your Drake companion is going to attack that orc until it's dead, then every turn that that orc remains alive, you would simply forgo the use of your own bonus action until the Drake manages to kill that off, and then you can use another bonus action to change what it's going to do on the next round. Now, your Drake companion does have its own movement that is independent of your character, and it does also have an independent reaction. This means that it can take advantage of things like an attack of opportunity, and you could declare that as part of your bonus action, that something that they will wait on for a condition and ready an action for that. So they do have their own capability to set up reactions. And this is very similar to what you would do with your own character. The normal range of actions are a bite or a breath weapon when it comes to the style of attacks. But the Drake does not get the breath weapon until your character reaches level 11. So initially you're only going to really be able to do bite-related attacks. However, they do have a reaction where they can infuse another attack made by a creature that is within 30 feet of where your Drake is currently located and add additional damage to that attack. That would match the type of damage that you chose at the time that you summoned your Drake, utilizing their Drake Essence trait. So if you selected cold, then you would be adding cold damage to that attack. Additionally, some other actions can be done as well, as long as it falls under something that the Drake has the ability to do. So there is still some room for a level of creativity when it comes to working with a team or even setting up combinations. If your character is incapacitated, your Drake will be able to take other actions beyond just simply the dodge action, as the idea here is it now switches into a mode of protection in relation to your character, so there are some situations where your command is not always required. As long as the Drake is not reduced to 0 hit points, it will remain on the field of battle as well as simply remain summoned. This means if your character takes a long rest, it will still be there when your character wakes up. However, your character can use this feature again after taking that long rest to summon a new Drake that might do a different type of damage. So it is possible to quote-unquote swap out the damage type as needed, but this will require your character to complete that long rest and then go through the process of summoning the Drake again. Of course, that assumes that you had just summoned that Drake earlier in the day and had not yet had a long rest since you last summoned the Drake. If, however, you haven't gone through the process of summoning the Drake, say it's been awake for several days or around for several days, obviously you haven't used the summoning capability, so you could theoretically sit down and execute a resummoning at that particular point in time. Normally, once your character summons a Drake, they would not be able to do so again, but once your character has used up that quote-unquote free use, they can burn a first level or higher spell slot in order to be able to resummon your Drake once again. So let's say that you had 2 first level spell slots and you've already summoned your Drake and you haven't yet completed a long rest, but your Drake has died. You can use one of those spell slots to re-execute the summoning process and call forth your Drake again. So I've gone ahead and I'm now sharing the Dungeon Master screen, and I'm doing this so that I can show you what the process is in order to go through and create your Drake companion. The first thing the Dungeon Master is going to want to do is ensure that they expand the campaign grouping here. And that is because they need access to this NPCs section. Once open, all they have to do is search for the keyword Drake. And what they're looking for is this Drake companion template NPC sheet here. So I'm going to just simply open that up and set that aside. Now, at this particular point in time, the Dungeon Master is going to have to understand what Draconic Essence you are going to make use of. And the Draconic Essence is right here. And this allows you to choose the damage type that any attack this particular Drake companion is going to do is going to make use of. And those types are acid, cold, fire, lightning, or poison damage. Now, there are a number of things that have to be done beyond selecting the type of damage that your Drake is going to do in order to set this particular companion up. On the other tab, there are a number of instructions that can be used to guide the Dungeon Master in creating the Drake and setting up the appropriate stats. But here's the problem. This is a template, and you can't unlock a template. So what actually has to happen is that the NPC needs to be copied, and you do that by dragging a copy of the template back into the NPC sheet, or you can create it down here. I generally find it's safer to simply copy it into the NPC sheet and then pop that particular copy of it open. Now, once done, the Dungeon Master can unlock it and begin the process of editing this, including the title up here. So I generally recommend that a player assign a name to the Drake, and that is simply because you want to be able to uniquely identify each type of Drake that you're going to summon, one for cold, one for fire, etc., etc. And the Dungeon Master really should create a number of these copies in order to be able to, quote-unquote, quickly provide that functionality at the time that you go through and summon them. Now, I've gone ahead and reopened the template here and just set it to the other tab so that I can use it for reference as I go through and fill in and modify all of the elements that have to be updated here. And you can see there are quite a few things that we can change in relation to the Drake Companion. Now, the Dungeon Master is also going to want to ensure that your character information sheet is also loaded on their system so that they can use that for reference for things like the proficiency bonus that is going to be required when modifying some of these stats. Now, in the past, I have generally recommended that a Dungeon Master go through and simply manipulate all of these fields as required. But I've actually felt that there is a much better way to do this, and I have come up with that particular method. So what I'm going to do is set what has to absolutely be set here, and then we're going to go through and create a series of effects on our character sheet that we can apply that take care of a lot of the dynamic things. So one of the few things that we do have to deal with right here is going to be the total number of hit points. In relation to the reference sheet here, it states that you have to calculate the total number of hit points as 5 plus 5 times your ranger's level. Well, right now, at this particular point in time, your ranger is level 3. So that would be 15 plus 5, giving your Drake a total number of 20 hit points. Now, another thing that I generally like to do is define how many hit die the Drake has, because it does state that you have to set up the hit die. And this can be used during short rests in order to be able to go through and recover hit points. In this particular case, the type of die are D10s, and it's equal to the ranger level. So we can change this particular string here to say 3d10 hit die. And that would be adjusted each time your character is increased a level. So you're going to want to keep that in mind. I'm going to call it hit dice as opposed to hit die. Now, there are several things I'm going to also clear out of our particular template. So if you scroll down a little bit further, technically we need to modify the saving throws as per this line. We also need to add in the damage immunity, but I'm going to do that through effects as opposed to simply modifying this because I want to minimize how many times this particular template has to be updated. And the only real thing that we really should have to adjust is going to be the total number of hit points, as well as the cold or type of damage, I should say, that this particular creature is going to do. And that's just going to make things a lot simpler for the Dungeon Master. What I am going to do, though, is eliminate the statement where it states plus PB piercing damage or plus PB blah, blah, blah. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because I'm going to handle the damage bonuses as well as the attack bonuses through effects. And I don't want any statement there, plus PB, to screw up what that roll is going to be. Now, this next part is going to be where setting up multiple copies of the Drake is going to come into play, and that is specific to the type of damage. You're going to want to look at anything in this particular breath weapon section that has a bracket damage wrapped around it, and that is because this is setting up the type of damage that particular breath weapon is going to do. Now, granted, your Drake doesn't get the ability to make use of this until level 11, but you might as well set it up now. So let's say, for example, that I'm going to create a Drake that does fire damage. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the Dungeon Master modify this so that it replaces that bracket damage bracket keyword combination there with fire damage. And that will set up the type that particular damage what that Drake is going to do for damage. I'm also going to make sure that I modify this line down here, because we need to be sure that we add in the extra 1d6 fire damage as part of the infused strike. You could do it here, or you could do it through an effect. I'm modifying it here so that we keep a consistent damage type here on this particular NPC sheet. Now, in theory, we have set this Drake up to do fire damage. You'll want to do the exact same thing for the other types of damage to give you, the player, the flexibility, the means to summon the right kind of Drake at the time that you want to summon that Drake. That way, the only thing that might have to be adjusted after the fact is updating the number of hit points. And that is simply to take into account that maybe you haven't called on that particular version of the Drake for an X number of levels. But I'm now going to give this a name. Let's see. And I'm just going to simply call it Fire Drake Companion. And that is simply to identify to the Dungeon Master that I'm using fire as the damage type. I'm then going to lock that into place because there is nothing else we need to do here. Everything else we should theoretically be able to deal with through an effect that we can provide onto our character when we summon that Drake. So with that done, I'm going to close out this here, and then I'm just simply going to take this icon here and drop it on top of the Ranger. And what's going to happen is that's going to pop up our character on the player side and allow us to actually use that Drake from this point forward as long as that Drake exists. However, there is a slight flaw with this. This particular Drake can't be dragged into the combat tracker. The Dungeon Master is going to have to do that. And unfortunately, that Dungeon Master is going to have to create an instance of that Drake in order for any of the actual attack and damage capabilities to simply function. So we kind of did this part a little bit early, but I wanted to show how that was going to work. Now, I've just gone ahead and unshared that Drake companion, so if I tried to open up that particular companion on the player side, it's not going to work, and we're back on the Dungeon Master screen. The actual proper method to deal with this is to apply that particular Drake into the combat tracker so it's ready to go. Now, to ensure that a player gets a quote-unquote actionable copy of the Drake companion, all you have to do is open up the combat tracker and drag and drop it into place using this icon here. You cannot use this token, you can't use any other aspect of this to add it to the combat tracker. You're also going to want to ensure that both the initiative roll matches that of the Ranger and that they are friendly. And I just realized I didn't update the Ranger to reflect the Drakewarden side of things. I'll do that in a moment. At this point, this companion is now ready to be shared over to the Ranger. What you'll want to do is grab this particular dragon icon, or whatever icon your particular theme is presenting, and drop that on the player. Now that's going to create an instanced copy of the Drake to the player, which we can see here on the screen. But we'll come back to how this particular character is going to work within a combat tracker situation in a moment. The first thing I want to do is take care of the effects that we are going to need to deal with in relation to this particular companion. So I'm going to minimize all of these and drag this into place. I'm also going to create a new group called Drakewarden and ensure that that's ready. Now, all of the effects that I'm about to add, we can pretty much cover with one single effect. So I'm going to start off with just that for now, and then we'll see where we have to go from there. So the effect looks like this, and it's a bit long-winded, so I'm going to just go ahead and expand that out a little bit. First off, I'm calling this Drake Companion, and in brackets, I'm actually going to put the keyword fire. And that's going to tell me that this is the effect that I want for any fire Drake that I have summoned. This is going to have a semicolon here, an AC, all in capital letters, colon, and then PRF within square brackets, and PRF is all capitalized. That's going to add our proficiency bonus to the armor class for the Drake. SAVE, all in capital letters, colon, and that's after a semicolon here, again with PRF there. That's going to add our proficiency bonus to the dexterity and wisdom saving throws, which is what our Drake requires. You can see that right here. They are going to be immune to fire damage because they gain that immunity. They have our proficiency bonus added to their attack, so ATK : PRF, all in brackets, square brackets, semicolon, DMG in PRF once again. And that's because we add our proficiency bonus to the attack and damage rolls that our Drake is going to do with their bite. It's going to go on a Drake companion only, but we can't set that specifically. So we just have to be sure that we drag and drop it onto that Drake. And it's a permanent increase. So as long as that Drake is around, it doesn't expire from a duration perspective and it doesn't get expended. So that's going to be the effect that we're going to apply to the Drake inside of the combat tracker. And I'm simply going to drag and drop that into place. And you can see here that the numbers have been calculated out for us. So AC 2, save 2 for dexterity and wisdom, immunity to fire, attack 2, and damage 2. That means that it has properly read our character's proficiency bonus and applied the effects appropriately. Now, I highly recommend, because there's a chance you might decide to summon a different kind of Drake at a later point in time, you go through and preload the different kinds of effects that you will need for the immunity. So when it comes to fire, you have this, but when it comes to cold, this isn't going to work. You'll want to make sure that you adjust that. Now, there are two ways that you can do this. You can copy this particular effect multiple times and simply modify the reference here for fire to cold, for example, and update this to be cold. Or you can break that particular portion of the immunity out and make a separate effect specific to that. I actually recommend you simply modify this one and copy it multiple times, simply due to the fact that it saves you from having to worry about clicking on two effects. You just click the one and you know you've got the right one. So to show you what that looks like, I have gone ahead and updated our character's action sheet to include all of those copies of that effect. And if you look here, once I've got our character in a combat and actions scenario, you'll see that the order that I've created these in, and yes, I had to delete the original fire one to ensure that the order was correct, is the exact same order alphabetically of the type of damage that your particular Drake could do. Now all I have to do is drag the appropriate effect onto our companion in order to change the type of immunity that that particular Drake is going to be doing, as well as ensure that everything else associated with it is linked properly. So while I was going through and editing this video, I realized that there's actually a flaw with this statement here. The problem is going to be specifically with this damage element here. We don't want that to apply to the breath weapon. We only want this to apply to the bite. So in order to address that, we need to simply add in melee to the end of this particular statement. And you will see that we do that a little bit later on in the video for another feature that we add at one point as well. I believe it's Bond of Fang and Scale. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly update each of these particular entries for this effect so that we can correct that problem. So I've gone ahead and reapplied the effect to our particular Drake, although I selected the wrong damage type for the Acid Drake, but I was just using this as an example. Now, you can add melee to this attack portion too if you want to go ahead and restrict it to just being able to make use of the bite attack. It's not required because I don't believe the Drake actually gets any other kind of attack that requires an attack roll that would be classified as range. So it's up to you whether you decide to or not. However, you can see here that with the new restriction in place when it comes to the damage, you can see that the bite attack gets a +6 because I'm using this at a slightly higher level in addition to the attack and the damage here. So you can see this +6 here. But when I roll the damage for the breath weapon, you can see that there is no longer a plus to that particular damage. There will be some additional elements to that later on that you will see in the video where you still see that modifier. That's because this particular portion of it is being added after I've gone through and started the editing process. Now, the nice thing here is that we are essentially done when it comes to our setup. And the reason why I say that, outside of creating additional copies of the Drake Companion here, is because this we don't have to worry about. When we made the adjustment to set this to fire damage, we converted this into an effect. So if I were to drag this onto an ally, for example, let's say this one here, I'm going to simply drag that out and drop it into there. And you'll see that what it's going to do is add a DMG 1d6 fire. What that means is that when the ape actually does the damage, because you've chosen to react and infuse that particular ape with that damage, they would be able to automatically have the extra 1d6 fire damage rolled as part of their attack roll or damage roll. So this is set up. This is now complete. The only thing that we will have to keep in mind going forward is that as our Drake levels and as our character levels, the total number of hit points is going to increase. And when we get to a point where our proficiency bonus increases, we simply have to delete this effect and reapply the effect once again in order for it to take into account our increase when it comes to that proficiency bonus. And I'll be sure to show you what that looks like at level 5 so that you can see what that process is going to be. Now, before we get into how this particular Drake Companion works, there's one last thing that I want to do. Now that the Dungeon Master has shared this particular instance of the Drake Companion over to you, when that Drake is removed from the combat tracker, and I'll do that here in a second, this particular instance of it is going to go away. So if I go ahead and share over the Dungeon Master screen again, so I'm going to make it a upper left copy of it there, you'll see that I'm going to pop open the combat tracker and I'm going to delete the Drake from the combat tracker. You'll notice that the Drake is now gone and that it is no longer accessible to us. We cannot find it in the NPCs section at all. That's normal Fantasy Grounds behavior. And this is going to take into the situation as to when you have chosen to let your Drake go in the sense that you release their summoning, or they have died and have dissipated. You're going to want to resummon that particular Drake. To do that, you're going to want to make sure that the Dungeon Master makes use of an updated version of that particular Drake before they share it back over to you through the combat tracker. That's the reason why we have selected to ensure that we share the combat tracker copy of the Drake over, not a simple instance of the Drake. Now, it took me about 5 minutes, but I went through and I set up a copy of each of the individual types of Drakes that could be summoned. So I've got the Acid Drake, the Cold Drake, the Fire Drake, the Lightning Drake, and the Poison Drake, all set up with the appropriate damage type, so that now when our character levels, all I have to do as a Dungeon Master is simply ensure that I update the total number of hit points by increments of 5. Now, you could theoretically offload the requirement to do that by setting up a temporary hit point capability on the NPC side of things. So, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show how that's going to work. So, I've gone ahead and I've reset all of the hit point totals for each of these Drakes to be 5, because that's the base hit points that that particular Drake is going to have. Now, you could theoretically clear out the description here. I'm not going to worry about that right now. What I am going to do is set up a temporary hit point capability on the Drakewarden side of things and show you how that works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to further modify this particular Drake Companion capability, and I'm going to add in what's classified as a heal effect. I'm going to set this to be temporary hit points, and I'm simply going to make a static modification. The first thing I want to do is find the level LVL indicator here. And that's because we have to set things up for 5 times our level. I'm going to put a 5 multiplier here, and what you will see here is that our temporary hit points is now 15 for this particular character. Excellent, because that's exactly what we're looking for. And when our character levels up, that will become a 20. When they become level 5, that will become 25. Perfect. This is going to work appropriately for our particular character. Now, I'm going to go ahead and simply add in the Drake Companion once again. And let's say this time I decide to go with the Acid Drake. I'm going to drop that into place, make sure that they're shared. Now, me as a player, I'm going to go ahead and automatically set up the total number of hit points. Not for me. Sorry, that should have been for the Drake Companion. And I'm going to set up the acid effect on the Drake Companion. Now, in order for you to see the total number of hit points that that Drake has, they have to be friendly. And you can see right here that they have 15 temporary hit points. Now, what this means is that now that the Dungeon Master has preloaded all of the various kinds of Drakes that you could theoretically summon, They don't need to do any further work. At the time that you summon your Drake, you simply apply the temporary hit points. It's going to function the exact same way that we need it to function within Fantasy Grounds when it comes to how hit point damage is dealt. And when they burn through their temporary hit points, they're going to have 5 hit points left. If, however, you have gone through and one of your party members maybe has gone through and healed that companion, then some adjustment can be made to the hit points or to the temporary hit points to take that into account. So it does push a little bit more work back into the player side of things when it comes to managing and manipulating hit points that way, although the Dungeon Master is still going to have to do that for you because you can't modify this field at all as a player. Only the Dungeon Master can. So that is something that you'll want to keep in mind. However, you may just simply want to unsummon your Drake and then resummon them, and then they'll have full hit points. That's entirely up to you. There is something that I forgot to set up in relation to tracking when we actually execute the summoning process for our Drake companion. Right now, this particular feature here doesn't have that capability. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up, copy this particular group here, and then go ahead and paste that into place. I'm then going to adjust this copy of that to say summon Drake companion. I'm going to leave the rest of that statement there, and then change this into preparation mode and set it for once daily. Now we can go ahead and track when we actually summon the Drake companion. I'm also going to need to set this up as part of a spell because you can use a first or higher level spell slot in order to once again use this or summon your Drake companion after you've gone through and essentially used up your free use. To do that, all I'm going to do is pop open this Cure Wounds, copy this into place, rename it to the exact same thing that I have here, and then simply delete this effect. Now we have a means to actually execute a spell when it comes to going through and summoning our Drake or make use of our free use. In order for this to actually function properly, though, you need to prepare the spell. So you need to make sure that you check mark all of these particular spells in order to make sure that they show up properly inside of the combat and actions mode, so that when you do summon the Drake, you can just simply do this to indicate you're summoning it, and then go ahead and select a first level spell slot in order to actually have your Drake companion set up and make use of your spell slot. Now, how do you as the player use that Drake? Well, the first things first is the Dungeon Master is going to have to reshare the appropriate sheet. You can choose to drag and drop that down to here if you wish, so that you can gain access to it again after combat. As long as the Drake isn't removed from the combat tracker, this sheet will remain statically shared to your character. So it's not going to go away until your Drake is removed from the combat tracker. So now that everything is shared over, we can go ahead and show you what this is going to look like from a combat situation. And I'm going to advance the turn to be the Drake companion. And the reason why I'm doing that is because of a couple of things. You yourself, as the player, cannot manipulate who the Drake is targeted. The Dungeon Master will have to do that for you. But there is still a way that you can make use of this capability as part of the player and not have to worry about interfering with the Dungeon Master. So, what do I mean by that? Well, on the Drake companion turn, let's say we want to attack this vampire. Well, what you could do is simply drag and drop the attack associated with the vampire onto the vampire's character, or NPC reference here in the combat tracker. In this case, that's a hit. So now I can go ahead and do damage. Now, it's piercing damage, so this particular Drake isn't going to get through that. But let's say at level 11, you have now unlocked the ability to make use of this saving throw here. Unfortunately, we still have to fix up one minor thing. This is why you playtest stuff, is because we forgot to set the spell DC save entry here in order to actually go through and configure this. We can't actually trigger a dexterity saving throw. So let's go ahead and fix that. To fix this, we need to take a look at what your character's spell save actually is, or DC. To do that, you need to go to spellcasting for your character and scroll all the way down until you get to the bottom here. And for a spell save DC, it's going to be 8 plus your proficiency bonus plus your wisdom modifier. In this particular case, that means that we have a wisdom modifier of +3, so that's going to make it an 11, and a proficiency bonus of +2, which makes it a 13 for our total spell save. So to do that, all we have to do is have the Dungeon Master temporarily unlock and modify the action sheet here and adjust that. So we want to adjust the value to be a 13. As soon as we do that, you will see here that we now have a 13 reference. And this is now clickable. That means we've fixed this problem. So let's go back to our combat example. Now that we have the saving throw requirement fixed, all we have to do is drag and drop that on top of the vampire, and that's going to force them to roll a saving throw. In this particular case, they have succeeded. But they're still going to suffer some damage because it still does damage even if they make their saving throw. It only does half damage though. To deal with that, we drag and drop the damage on top of the vampire, let the system roll the damage, and apply that damage to the vampire. So this confirms that we have now solved this particular problem. Now the last thing that I want to show in relation to this is specific to this saving throw section here. I want to show that how you as a player would execute a saving throw would be simply to roll this. You click once, and that will trigger a dexterity-based saving throw. And you can see here that there is a +2 effect that is added. The same thing will happen when you click the saving throw for wisdom. And that just confirms that this effect here is working for our saving throws. Perfect. There's not much else we have to do here. So I've gone ahead and advanced our character to level 5, and that's because I want to showcase what happens when you're dealing with your proficiency bonus increase. There are, in fact, 2 things that have to be dealt with. The saving throws that are going to be triggered by the breath weapon here need to have this incremented by 1. So instead of it being a DC 13, it's a DC 14. So the Dungeon Master and only the Dungeon Master is going to be the only one that can make that adjustment. I'm going to go ahead and you will see that that should change live. Perfect. Now, in relation to setting up the effect again, all you have to do is simply drag or open up your effect here, your Actions tab, remove the old effect, and then drag the new effect into place. Additionally, you will now be able to drop the temporary hit points on your character, or on your companion rather, to bring them up to the right number of temporary hit points. So at level 5, your character, or your Drake rather, has a total of 25 plus their default 5, so for a total of 30 hit points. And as long as this value is higher than what the value is that exists within this temporary field here, it will allow you to drag and drop it and bring it up to that value. And that's all you have to do to change that. At Ranger level 7, your character is now going to gain the Bond of Fang and Scale feature, and it adds further enhancements to your Drake at the time of summoning. Once summoned at this level, your Drake companion will now have wings as part of their physical manifestation, and that they will grow each time your character summons the Drake. While summoned, but not while being used as a mount, it can use those wings and will gain a flying speed that is equal to their normal walking speed. But it also adds some new capabilities between you, specifically your character, and the Drake companion while the companion has been summoned. The first is that you can now use the Drake as a mount, as long as your character is of size medium or smaller. However, even though it has the means to fly at this point, as I've already stated earlier, you won't be able to use it as a mount for the purposes of flying around. It will be stuck on the ground. Another enhancement is that when your Drake bites and makes their bite attack, they can now deal an extra 1d6 points of damage, and the damage type associated with the bite is going to be equal to that of the essence of the dragon. So if you summoned a Fire Drake, then you will now be able to do 1d6 points of piercing damage in addition to 1d6 points of fire damage. And this is a good thing because you're now enhancing the capabilities of what your dragon is able to do, and you can think of this as a precursor to them gaining their ability to actually breathe a specific kind of damage essence. You've gone from the Drake just simply doing piercing damage to the Drake now doing piercing damage plus an essence type of damage associated with it, and then finally you'll eventually be able to unlock the ability for them to breathe a specific weapon's damage. And the last benefit is that while the Drake has been summoned, your character's also going to gain the resistances to the type of damage your Drake is able to do. And because there's a bit of variation here, I'm going to show you how to preset the different types here so that you can select the appropriate type at the time that your Drake has been summoned. So first things first, I'm going to go ahead and drag Bond of Fang and Scale onto our character's action sheet and make sure that it's assigned to the appropriate group. I am then going to set this up and fix this up a little bit. So you can see here that the damage effect has already been configured. But there is a problem. It is not configured for the type of damage that our Drake can do. So I'm going to go ahead and just simply update this to be acid for the moment. And everything else stays the same. I'm going to then actually copy this and set up a name. So before I do anything else, of Fang and Scale, semicolon, and in bracket I will put acid. Space that out. Now, this modifies this particular effect so that it's now clear as to why all of a sudden our Drake is doing 1d6 points of acid damage, or fire damage, or cold damage. I'm going to go through and set up 4 additional effects associated with this, and then I'll show you how we deal with the resistance side of it. So I've completed adding in all of these effects, and these are going to be effects specific to the Drake, and I'll show you how to use these in a moment. The next thing I want to do is add in 5 other effects, and this is going to be set up so that our particular character can benefit from the resistances. So what this will look like is as follows. Bond of Fang and Scale, and again I'm putting the damage type here so that we can quickly identify which one we're going to be clicking on, and then resist acid. I'm also going to ensure that I set this one to self because it goes nowhere else. It can't be applied to anybody else. It doesn't expire and it doesn't really get expended. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing and load all of this into the other 4 effects. All right, so I've now completed adding in the effect. Once we're in our combat and action summary, what you will see is a number of buttons that are here. Keep in mind there are only 5 damage types, so if you want to get to the effect that deals with our own character, simply count over 6 effects, or 6 buttons. So the first 5 will be what gets added to our Drake, and the next 5 would be what gets added to your character. Before I go through the process of showing how that's going to work through a combat scenario, I want to make sure that I increase the size of the dragon, because if you recall, they've now grown, and as a result, they're now classified as a medium size as opposed to a small. To deal with that, the Dungeon Master is going to have to go through and unlock the NPC sheet once again, and simply modify this keyword small here for the size to be medium. And this will have to be done for all of the pre-existing copies of the companion that we've gone through and created. This also is important to do because it's going to affect the size of the icon that shows up on the combat map or the battle maps as they're dragged and dropped into place. It might also be worth going through and updating the icon here to reflect something that might be slightly larger, although this is simply a monster pog in relation to Fantasy Grounds, so it still functions and it will still work for the purposes that you need it to actually function. But I highly recommend maybe making it a little bit larger once it's on the actual battle map, just to reflect the size increase. So you can see here, I have gone ahead and adjusted the size of all of the various copies of the Drake that we have. In addition to that, I've also increased the total number of hit dice that are referenced here to remind us that this Drake can execute 7 hit die of recovery die during a rest period. Now, the last thing that has to happen is our Drake has to be removed from the combat tracker. And the reason for that is that this particular instance of the Drake is referencing the small version of the Drake, not the medium-sized version of the Drake. So you're going to want to go ahead and delete that from the combat tracker and then drag and drop in a replacement and set it up so that it's once again friendly. And this will allow the player to go through and execute all of the things that they need to do in order to update the temporary hit points that they have, as well as reapply the effects. So let's show how this is going to work in relation to the combat tracker. The first things first is that this bond implements something that is permanent. So I'm going to quickly drag and drop this onto our Drake. Now what's going to happen is that they are going to automatically be able to do 1d6 points of acid damage anytime they bite. And that's with this effect. The problem is we have to set up a restriction here that I forgot to do. This should be a melee-based attack. Because remember, they do have the ability at some point to gain access to a breath weapon, which is a ranged attack. So we need to restrict this effect so that it only deals with the melee attack. We can do that by modifying the effect and simply adding the keyword melee to the end of this. Actually, there's a minor adjustment that needs to be made to that, and that's to add in a comma here. So we'll want to make sure that we go through and update this effect for all of the ones that the dragon can do, or the Drake can do. We don't want to touch those that affect our character. And this should be the last one. Now, this should restrict the type of damage that our Drake can do to simply be, oops, not to our character, specifically for melee damage. And you can see here that it's properly updated the effect, so we know this has come into play. Now, the other thing that you'll want to do is ensure that you add the same damage type to your character. And that's going to apply resistance to your character. And these two effects remain as long as your Drake is summoned. So the only time your Drake is not going to be summoned is when they're not part of the combat tracker. That's it. So as long as both of your characters remain in the combat tracker, these effects should stick and stay around. So let's go ahead and actually confirm that when we go through and make an attack with our Drake, that the extra acid damage is added. So I'm going to pop that open so that we can see it on the screen here. And I'm going to set up the action token to be the Drake here. I'm then going to pop this open and go ahead and set up a bite attack on that vampire. So I'm going to go through and make my attack. Excellent. That's going to be a hit. Now when I roll damage, we should see that there are 2 die that get rolled, not just 1. Now something that I've noticed is that our damage effect went away. That should not have actually happened. This should not be on next roll. This should be never. And why is that on self? I don't know why those got updated. At least that one did. Didn't, rather. Okay, we're good there. We're good there. I must have just misclicked it when I was setting everything else up. That's entirely possible. Self. Yep. Okay, so everything else looks like it's okay. So now I'm going to re-roll that damage again just to be sure. I'm going to pop this open. Oops. Pop this open again. Do my bite attack damage on the vampire. Oops, I got to reapply the effect. Duh. I'm having a day today, apparently. There we go. Okay, good. Now it hasn't gone away, so it's going to stay around. Now, if I roll my breath weapon, so I'm going to force the vampire to make a saving throw so that I can do the acid damage. What we should see here is that we should still see 8 die of damage. We do not see the extra damage here at all. Excellent, because we only see 8d6, which is exactly what we're rolling. We don't see 9d6 there. Perfect. We've now got this effect set up appropriately. Now, if our character suffers acid damage, I'm just simply going to simulate that by dropping that onto there. What we should see is some damage gone through because of piercing, but some of it also partially resisted because the acid damage would be resisted. So we had a total of 8 points of damage, but we only suffered 6. That means that 2 points of this damage was resisted, which would be equal to half of the acid damage die roll here. Perfect. That means that our resistance is working the way that we want it to. Now, when it comes to using the mount functionality, all you do is you declare to the Dungeon Master that you are going to ride the Drake to whatever destination you're going to get to, but keep in mind you can't yet fly with them while you're using them as a mount. At Ranger level 9, your characters once again increased on their proficiency bonus. So the very first thing you'll want to do is remove the effect specific to Drake Companion and reapply it to ensure that the increases are taken into account. Additionally, the Dungeon Master is once again going to have to adjust this DC saving throw here. Instead of it being a 14, it now needs to be a 15. So I'm going to go ahead and make that modification. And remember, all of these changes have to be made on all of the copies of the character sheet or the companion sheet. But that's literally all of the changes that do have to be dealt with in relation to that. So I think we're okay. At Ranger level 11, your characters now finally gained the Drake's Breath Weapon, which now unlocks the means for your Drake Companion to actually use their Breath Weapon. The type of damage that this is going to do is specifically related to the type of damage you selected for the Drake. So if you selected a Fire Drake, then you're going to be doing fire damage. If you selected an Acid Drake, then you're going to be doing acid damage. Now, it can be expelled as a 30-foot cone, which means that any creature within that cone effect will be able to be forced to make that saving throw, as well as to suffer either the full damage or the half damage, depending on what you rolled. But here's the kicker. This breath weapon can be expelled from the Drake or from your own character. You both gain that capability. Now, at level 11, the breath weapon is going to do 8d6 points of damage, but when your character reaches level 15, this is going to increase to 10d6 points of damage, so there's 2 additional d6 points of damage there. Now, we can make the adjustment ahead of time, or we can wait till level 15 to go ahead and do that. I'm going to wait till level 15 so that we can see what that adjustment looks like. And finally, once this feature is used, it can't be used again unless your character completes a long rest or a 3rd level or higher spell slot is expended in order to be able to do it again. This is going to give you temporary capability of being able to cast that feature again before completing the long rest. So what this means is that when you make use of this breath weapon here, your Drake can only do it once, unless you yourself expend a level 3 spell slot. Then they can do it again. Once a long rest has been completed, at that particular point in time, does your Drake essentially regain the free use of that breath weapon before having to go through and have you expend spell slots again. Because this is something that can go through and be executed as both a once-use feature as well as a spell, we're going to have to add this to our character's action sheet for when our character goes through and executes the breath weapon as opposed to using it from the Drake. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this into place, move this down into the Drakewarden, and pop that open. Now, unfortunately, this isn't correct. And that's because I got to go through and set up the base value to be wisdom. Now that should fix this up. We hadn't done that yet for this particular group. But everything else is now here and ready to go, and it's set up to automatically do half damage. So we don't need to do anything else when it comes to the feature, except set up a preparation. We can only use this once as part of our free use. But here's the thing. You're going to want to tick this off regardless of whether you use this from the Drake or from your own character. So that is something you will want to take into account. And we'll show that as part of our demonstration. Now, the next thing is having a level 3 spell here. Here's the problem. You can't simply take this and move this into spells and have it apply because it goes into the cantrips section, which really isn't appropriate. What we want to do instead is simply go to spells, set our level to level 3, and then make sure that we choose a ranger spell just to simplify things for us. It doesn't really much matter what one. We just need it to go ahead and create an entry here. I'm then going to update this to be Drake's Breath, and it's going to stay in the spells group. I am then also going to go ahead and add in these 2 parts to this effect here. So I'm going to create a cast as well as a damage effect here. So the first thing I'm going to do is set this up to be a dexterity-based saving throw. You'll see here that because we selected a ranger-based spell, it's automatically calculating out our setup here for the correct DC. In addition, the ability has been set up to use Wisdom. Excellent. If you don't see that, make sure you check this and update this, and it should automatically correct that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So the casting part is now set up. Now we just simply want to do the damage. And what we want to do is 8d6. So we want to simply right-click there, grab 5, and hold down the left mouse button, and then right-click 3 more times to bring it to 8. So we should see that we have 8d6. The only thing we have left to do around this particular one is simply to add in the damage type. Now, we'll also want to ensure that we update this one to mirror that damage type. The thing that's missing, though, is the extra types of damage that you could potentially do. All right, so I've gone ahead and added in the extra types of damage, and this just preloads everything so we don't have to worry about it every time we switch out the type of damage our Drake can do. You will want to make sure that you update these to add two additional d6 die at level 15, but we'll get to that once we get there. So right now, our setup for Drake's Breath is initially done and ready to go. Now, I noticed while editing that I had actually made a mistake here. I forgot to enable half on save, and that's because the saving throw does require that. It also matches it up with what's going on for our feature, so just be sure you fix that before you continue on. So, at this particular point in time, this is how this is going to work. If we're going to use our feature, and it's going to be our character that is going to make use of this, then our companion is going to lose the ability to actually use their own breath weapon. But let's say that I'm going to attack the vampire here. I can force them to make an actual roll here, saving throw. They failed, which means that when I spit acid damage at them, they will suffer heavy damage. I then need to tick off that that's used, and I then need to recall that my Drake cannot use this breath weapon. It's been used. Our character has used it. The only attack that they can do is the bite or add the reaction for infused strikes. Those are the only two things that they can do now. At a later point in time, you'll see here that we have 3 level 3 spell slots. In theory, we could burn a spell slot. In theory, though, let's say we're 3 turns down, I'm now going to go ahead and use a 3rd level spell slot and attack the vampire again. They fail again. I'm now going to throw the acid damage at them, and they're going to suffer that damage. This guy's still alive, geez. But anyway, I now have to tick off a 3rd level spell slot because I used the spell version of it rather than the featured version of it. Now, the last thing that you'll want to do before finishing up in relation to Drake's Breath, specifically the spell version of it, is simply to ensure it's prepared. And that is only to ensure that when you're in a combat and action mode, the capability to click this icon here is available to you so that you can indicate that you're casting that spell in the chat log. If you don't do that, this option isn't going to be there. And on top of that, there is a risk that the spell itself won't even be available. Although it doesn't so much become an issue for a ranger, it does for characters like wizards and whatnot. Now, while editing, I noticed that there was going to be an issue with some of the statements I made around when Drake's Breath can actually be used. So to clear that up, Drake's Breath can be used from your character or from your Drake. However, when you go through and expend a spell slot for that, it does not in fact matter whether the turn is yours or whether the turn is the Drake's. You're essentially working as a team. So when the Drake is going to go through and actually execute that particular breath weapon, you've already told them that they're going to do that as part of your bonus action, which means you're going to have expended that 3rd level spell slot in preparation for that. That's how that particular expenditure is going to work in relation to that. So you get to do the expelling of the breath weapon, or you simply indicate that your Drake is going to do it, and then you tick off that 3rd level spell slot, and then the Drake executes the attack using their breath weapon. That's how it is going to work. Now, the one thing about a spell is that once you've gone through and burnt through all your spell slots for a particular level, I'm going to pop that open so that you can see it, you lose the ability to cast that level of spell. This is exactly what we want, because this should go away after we've used up all of our 3rd level spell slots, and the feature itself here has gone away. Perfect. So we're controlling the ability to use this feature as intended. So level 13 once again sees a proficiency bonus increase occur here. So we need to make sure that we reset the feature that is on our Drake. So I'm going to go ahead. Right, I'm in preparation, so I need that. I'm going to apply this effect to our character so that it now takes into the increases there. I'm also going to apply the temporary hit points to increase that. I haven't done that in a while. You'll want to make sure that you do that every level, just as an FYI, when it comes to the temporary hit points. But the last thing that needs to happen now is that the saving throw here needs to be adjusted. And this is the only location where the saving throw needs to be adjusted because it's automatically going to be calculated for the two features we just added to our character's action sheet. So I'm going to go ahead and update this, be a 16. Excellent. That is now done. So that is the adjustment we have to make at level 13. At Ranger level 15, there are a couple of things that we have to do before we can move on to our next feature. And that is going to be setting up all of the damages specific to our Drake, as well as our Drake's breath weapon here that we have on both our level 3 spell slot and our feature. We need to modify these to add in 2 additional D6s. And you can just grab the 2 additional D6s and simply drop them into place, and it will add them. So you don't have to go through and delete the existing dice that are there. You can just simply add in the additional dice as required. I'm going to quickly do that here. For that one, that's done. Take this into account, as well as this group. So give me a moment. I will be done in a second here. And as you can see, it's not taking an overly long amount of time to go through and adjust this. So perfect. That takes care of that. The next thing that has to happen is that the Dungeon Master will need to modify the breath weapon entry here on the actual companion sheet. They're the only ones that can make that adjustment. And all they have to do is increase the 8d6 to 10d6 on all of the copies of the character sheet that exist. And that takes care of modifying our creature for the increase in damage. Now we can go ahead and take a look at Perfected Bond, which is the next feature that our character has gained as part of this feature. And I don't know why that stretched so far. Anyway, there we go. Okay, perfect. And what this does is it really unlocks some powerful options for your companion. While the Drake is summoned, the following benefits will become available to both you, your character, as well as to your companion. The first is that the Drake's Bite is now able to do an additional 1d6 of extra damage on top of the extra damage already being done as part of their increase that they'd already gained. This means that your Drake can now do a total of 3d6 points of total damage, 1d6 being piercing damage, and 2d6 now is equal to the damage type of the Drake that you have summoned. Now, if you recall, we added that to the bond of Fang and Scale, and all we have to do is adjust this 1d6 to be 2d6 points of damage. The piercing damage doesn't increase. It's actually the damage that has the damage type effect added to it that increases in this particular case. So we need to just simply go through and make this minor adjustment here. And as this is only something we have to do 5 times, that completes that adjustment for Empowered Bite. The next benefit is that the size of your Drake has also increased. They are now a large class creature. And as such, the restriction on flying while you're mounted has been removed. This means you can now use it as a flying mount. The restriction that your character is still medium or smaller still applies, however. Once again, this does mean that all of the NPC sheets need to be updated in order to actually go through and change the size over. So I'm going to go ahead and do that quickly, and then I'll be right back. So as you can see, I've completed changing the sizes of the various Drakes over to the correct size. But if you recall, the Drake that we have in the combat tracker is currently linked to the medium size because we made that adjustment when we increased the size from small to medium. We have to remove that particular Drake from the combat tracker and add in another Drake to replace that one and set it up for the same initiative roll. Now that this is set up, it will be linked to the large designation of the particular creature. Therefore, when this particular creature is added to the combat map or the battle map, it will size appropriately based on that statement. And the last benefit is that if your character or your Drake companion has taken damage while you're both within 30 feet of one another, one or the other can make a reaction and actually grant temporary resistance to that instance of the damage type, meaning that you can half the total damage being received. So this can be a little bit confusing, and as a result, I'm going to provide an example. Let's say that your Drake was hit with an attack, and they were about to suffer 30 points of slashing damage. As long as your character is within 30 feet of their Drake companion, your character can make use of a reaction to reduce that damage to 15 points of slashing damage because you're granting them temporary resistance to slashing damage. And the opposite is also true in that if it was your character that got hit, the Drake could intervene and reduce the amount of incoming damage by granting the appropriate temporary resistance. And while the information sheet explains that you're granting your Drake or your character the resistance, I feel that my description is a little bit more accurate because it essentially reflects what's happening on the field of battle. However, this particular portion of the effect can only be done a number of times equal to your character's proficiency bonus before they will need to complete a long rest to be able to do so again. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to drag and drop this into place. And I'm going to make sure that this is added to the Drakewarden group as well. Now this can actually go away, but I'm going to simply reuse this effect and make use of it for our resistance. I'm going to call this reflective resistance. Oops, that should be resistance, not resistance. Semicolon, resist all in capital letters, and then I've literally got every single damage type that's possibly available listed here. It doesn't go on self, nor does it default to any sort of expiration, although it should actually go on the next roll. What this is going to do is it's going to either apply only to your character or to your Drake. Now, your Drake, remember, has immunity to something, so you don't need to make any modifications, but your character only has resistances to a damage equal to the type that you have used for your Drake. Once this particular effect is added to your character, you need to temporarily remove this effect from the combat tracker. And that is because, in some cases, double resistance can equal immunity. And we want to avoid that particular situation. So I'll show you how to deal with that in just a moment. So let's, for the sake of example, claim that the vampire is going to attack our character. Let's make sure that I've got them targeted. Yep, okay, good. So the attack comes in. That was a miss. Excellent. Don't need to do anything. That's going to be a hit. There we go. Perfect. So now our character has been hit. Well, the way that this is going to work is that the Drake can intervene with the attack, meaning that you can temporarily gain resistance on that attack. But now that I've dropped this into place, I need to temporarily remove that so that I don't double up any resistance on acid damage. Now, when the damage comes in, there'll be a resistance and the effect goes away. At that particular point in time, you'll want to be sure that you go ahead and reapply the resistance for acid to ensure that it doesn't spill out or you forget and you suffer acid damage when you really shouldn't. But that's how that effect is going to work. And the exact opposite is going to happen when it comes to your Drake suffering the damage. The only thing is, you don't need to remove this effect because you can't go beyond immunity. So removing the effect is only going to grant temporary resistance to everything else. But if the creature's doing acid damage, you might as well just ignore it because they're not going to suffer any damage because your particular Drake of this particular class is already immune to that. So that's how that particular effect is going to work. Now, the empowered bite, that is already taken into account with our modification of this setup of Fang and Scale. Because we've already modified this for the 2d6, we don't have to do anything else in order to add in extra damage. It's already done for us. So whenever our Drake makes an attack, we apply that particular effect. Excellent, the damage is now done. So we simply remove that and we apply the appropriate effect, and that sticks around. So now they're able to do 2d6 points of acid damage on top of the 1d6 points of piercing damage that they deal with. That's it. Now, the only thing that we actually have to finalize is the number of uses that are associated with Perfected Bond. And that is going to be equal to your proficiency bonus. So at this particular level, that's a total of 5 uses. So we need to configure this for preparation and set that up for 5 daily uses. And the fact that I used one, I need to tick that off. Now, once we've gone through the process and used all of our Perfected Bond capabilities here, that would go away. And it's going to trigger regardless of whether you, the Ranger, reacted or whether the Drake reacted in reference to the reduction of damage. At character level 17, there are a few things that we have to deal with. The first is we have to increase the number of uses around Perfected Bond. So I'm going to make sure that that is updated to 6. We also need to make sure that we reapply our bonuses that we get from the Drake Companion, because once again, our Drake has now had an increase in their armor class and saving throw bonuses that they get, as well as their attack and damage rolls, because our proficiency bonus went from +5 to +6. The last thing that has to happen is that the Dungeon Master, once again, needs to make their final adjustment in relation to the breath weapon on the character sheet here. Specifically this part here. This has to now be a 17. So I'm going to go ahead and modify this and make the adjustment to a 17. And that's it. That is all of the changes that have to occur in relation to your character because of this particular subclass. Yeah, I don't know why, but I've always been partial to the Ranger class. Whether it's the isolation that they have in the woods, whether it's their strength because of that, or whether it's something else, I honestly don't know. What I do know is that this archetype is definitely going to enhance that desire to continue to play Rangers, and I may actually decide to take this one the next Ranger I create as opposed to going with the Monster Hunter, which is what I typically use. I love the concept of being able to work so cohesively with a character companion that this just adds to that level of comfort when I consider creating a new Ranger character. I have, however, not yet played this particular class specialization, and I'm definitely going to as soon as I get an opportunity to do so. However, this does bring us to the end of this particular video. I hope you found it useful and informative, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. I wish to thank you for taking the time to watch this particular video. I hope you found it informative and useful to familiarizing yourself with Fantasy Grounds in general, and that you had fun in the process. If you found the video useful and you liked the content of the particular video, go ahead and click that like button to let me know. And if you have any questions specific to the topic covered by this particular video, or just have some comments in general, please feel free to post something in the comment section, and I will do my best to respond to any questions that are asked. Additionally, I do release content quite regularly, and it's generally specific to Fantasy Grounds or 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons at this time. So if you'd like to be notified when new videos come out, go ahead and subscribe and click the notification bell to ensure that notification is sent to you when I release a new video.